The world is slowly waking up to the growing impact of AI. This exhibition in London is all about our relationship to computer technology. But AI remains in its infancy, still struggling through glitches in the system. Yet we're handing more and more decision-making over to the algorithm. I'm Corey Kreider. I'm a human rights lawyer. I investigated a drone strike in Yemen that killed my client Faisal bin Ali Jaber's family. What I found was a semi-automated targeting system used to describe who was and wasn't a threat. But as the big picture showed previously on The World According to AI, artificial intelligence isn't just used in military targeting, but in everyday policing as well. In this episode, we'll delve deeper into the power, potential, and prejudice of AI as people seek to use it to shape our world. One of the best established blind spots where the police have been seeking to use algorithmic material to accelerate and inform their practice is predictive policing. So the way that it works is this. Let's say that you've got a historically over-policed community, a community who are poor, a community of color. The algorithm takes that data and basically turns around and says, you went there before, you probably want to go there again. And so what everybody found, and study after study has shown this, is that it amplifies and accelerates the process of over-policing communities who are already over-policed. In the United States, the history of law enforcement has an unfortunate link to racism, going right back to the era of slavery. In the 18th century, groups of white men on horseback, paddy rollers as they were known, would go out on patrol looking for enslaved people who'd fled to freedom. If caught, those who'd run away would be horrifically beaten, mutilated, or killed. The paddy rollers would be assigned an area to patrol. It was known as their beat.
There's no question that policing in the US context certainly has grown out of slave catching. So let's go back to their original origins. People who tried to escape being enslaved were often hunted down and brought back into some type of system of control.
When slavery was abolished, the paddy rollers would evolve into what became formalized police units. And they didn't just abandon their old beats. Just as before, African Americans continued to bear the brunt of repressive police attention. With every crime recorded, every stop and search, every arrest, every sentence, a criminal history has been recorded. Data has been generated. Data that in the 21st century is being used to make predictions about future crime. We're now in the era of predictive policing.
It got its start in Los Angeles with the LAPD around 2010, 2011. It was actually the brainchild of an anthropologist and a mathematician. Jeff Branningham and George Moeller were two sort of social scientists who were studying crime patterns. And they realized that certain kinds of crimes are sort of viral, they're almost contagious in their way. So if there's one burglary in an area, it's actually statistically more likely that there'll be other burglaries in that area. And so they came up with an algorithm, and they pitched this to the LAPD. And the LAPD went with their first experiments to see if it worked. And for them, it worked enough that it began, and it suddenly took off.
The research that went into Jeffrey Branningham's algorithm was, for the most part, funded by the Pentagon. His initial work used military data to forecast insurgent attacks in places the US had invaded, such as Iraq and Afghanistan. But his focus shifted from battlefields abroad to supposed enemies at home. He created a company called Predictive that uses data from US police departments to tell US police departments where to look for criminality.
What happens is that when the vendors show these tools to the police say, that's exactly what we were going to do. And sometimes we describe this as selection bias meets confirmation bias, and they live happily ever after.
The idea that we use historical data to train machines and algorithms to predict into the future is very important. So, for example, if you live in a community that has historically been over-policed, you are more likely to have your algorithms point right back to those communities that have been over-policed. If you have people who have been over-arrested, like African Americans and Latinos and indigenous people, then your AI is going to point to those people.
Once you feed that data and say, okay, I see there's more crime here, let me go find some more. Well, guess what you're going to find? If you go look for more crime, you are going to find more crime where you look for it and not where you don't look for it.
But then they added in this extra element that every time there is a police contact, you get an extra point. So in some ways, they've created an almost self-fulfilling prophecy for the people, because the police are directed to go find the people with the most points. Then they go find the person who has the most points, and then the person gets an extra point. So tomorrow, where are they going to go? Hey, this guy has an extra point.
The consequence of that is that the database starts accumulating a lot higher fraction of all the crimes committed by black people than committed by white people. So when you turn an algorithm loose on that, it'll say, wow, black people are really dangerous, but we can ignore white people. So what happens is that the algorithm calcifies or embodies the bias in the policing.
Hamid, hi there. Corey.
Hey, Corey.
Really good to meet you, man. Really good to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Welcome. So, shall we?
Yeah, let's go take a look.
Hamid Khan is one of the lead organizers of the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, a collective that campaigns against what it believes to be growing police surveillance and criminalization of the local community.
Hey, guys.
In 2018, the coalition took the Los Angeles Police Department to court, forcing it to release the details of its predictive policing program.
There's two layers to predictive policing. One is a community and a location-based, where algorithms are used, and the company Predictive has developed that algorithm, which was owned by Jeffrey Brantham, who's a professor of anthropology and has a long history himself, how this thing was created on the fields of Afghanistan and Iraq, directly coming from the border, from the war zones. And the other piece is Operation Laser, which is a person and a location-based predictive policing program. Laser stands for Los Angeles Strategic Extraction and Restoration Program. And the reason why it's called Laser is that the creators of Laser said that we want to go into the community with a medical type precision and extract tumors out of the community like laser-like precision.
That's where they came up with the acronym.
That's how they came up with the acronym.
As people are tumors to be extracted. Okay.
Exactly.
What Predictive and Laser claim to offer is a one-stop crime prediction shop. The pitch is to tell police not just where crime will occur, but also who might commit crimes in the future. The LAPD was using these technologies to decide where to deploy their police patrols, focusing resources on so-called crime hotspots flagged by these algorithms.
So this is all the hotspots for a particular time period. Hotspots are created by the algorithm, the Predictive algorithm, where they use information, long-term crime history or short-term crime history, and then they create these 500 by 500 square foot hotspots.
On what basis? How are they deciding this?
So to put it very bluntly, there's a lot of pseudoscience, and now it's being presented as these computers are race neutral and they will predict where crime may happen.
But predictive policing doesn't just flag up a place. With Laser, it also sticks to a person. The LAPD maintains something called a chronic offenders bulletin. These bulletins are undisclosed reports on so-called persons of interest, people the police believe to be likely to break the law. This risk is calculated using a points-based formula based on data from police records, field interviews, and arrest reports. This is pulled together and scored by algorithmic software created by the defense contractor Palantir, a company with close ties to the U.S. military.
So how do you get yourself onto the laser system?
So these are the things that identified these risks. So if you're stopped and a field interview card is filled, 1 point.
So in other words, if the police stop me, I got a point.
1 point. Immediately you get a point. Now this individual was stopped the same day 3 times. So 3 points right there. If there had been a previous arrest with a gun, 5 points. If you had any violent crime, 5 points. Parole and probation is 5 points, and identified as gang affiliated, 5 points.
When it comes to the Chronic Offenders Bulletin, points can mean prison. But it's not just about locking people up. For Hamid Khan, the data suggests increased police attention at the borders of a historically deprived area called Skid Row, which helps keep the poor contained from the more affluent neighborhoods nearby.
So this is like a beachhead. So think of the defense of financial district from poor people.
Right.
You know, when we talk about hotspots, you know, you will see the dirty divide, how the proximity of extreme wealth and extreme poverty coexists right here, about 2 blocks from here.
Should we take a walk?
Absolutely.
Hey, what's going on?
Hey, good to meet you, man. Hey, good to meet you, Corey.
All right, General Dogon.
Hi there.
What's up, bro?
Hey, my brother.
See the building right there?
Yeah.
I meet Steve Richardson, who goes by his street name, General Dogon. He's a former prisoner and Skid Row resident who now works with the coalition, campaigning for greater protection for the local community.
So you guys have been doing work on this predictive policing stuff, right?
Exactly.
What does that look like out here on the street to people who live here?
So predictive policing rolls out in a lot of ways because, I mean, Skid Row is ground zeros for all experiments that happen, you know. So this is poor folks, of course. So all they little programs, the LAPD spy programs, everything that they come out with, right, is first tested right here. They first launched the Safer Cities initiative right here, which brought 110 extra police to Skid Row, making it the most police community, not only in America, but second in the world to Baghdad. We got all kind of patrols on Skid Row. So we got the cops on motorcycles, we got regular cops, we got SCI cops, we got East Side detail cops. That's all policing like a 15-block area. What are cops on horses good for right here? I mean, right smack in the middle of a housing crisis. You know, they have no other thing but to continue to come out here and criminalize people. About 80% of the people here are black, right? About 80% of people suffer from some form of a disability, maybe physical, you know, or mental, and all of us is poor. The most arrested person on Skid Row was a woman named Ann Moody. She was arrested 108 times.
108?
108 times for violating 4118D, right? 4118D is a municipal code to say you can't sit, sleep, and lie on public sidewalk. So her only crime was she was homeless and didn't have anywhere to go and was forced to sleep in public space.
She got arrested 118 times for being homeless.
108 times, yeah.
Hey.
Yeah, for just being in public space. And it was all, you know what I'm saying, based on a lot of predictive policing and stuff like that.
And the point you Dogon, and you, Hamid, are making is that this is a practice that goes way back, right? The over-policing of this community goes back decades. And then the information from that then gets fed into the computer, and the computer turns around and says, we'll go back and do some more of the same thing, essentially.
Right. And the computer, before the information gets in, the algorithm is designed for policing. So the algorithm would create outcomes that an agency wants to achieve. And this is really the key point. And the outcome that the agency wants to achieve in this community is cleansing and banishment.
Exactly.
We walk further along. The tents begin to thin out, as do the local residents gathered on the sidewalk. It's obvious we're approaching the outer limits of Skid Row, the hotspot boundary Hamid had pointed out earlier.
This is like a thunderstorm almost of hotspots that a person from Skid Row would be walking into. And this is where you will have more policing waiting for people to apprehend them, waiting for people to give them tickets, waiting for people to throw them against the wall, waiting for people to intimidate and harass and demand that they leave the neighborhood.
A few weeks after we left Skid Row, the LAPD announced that it was canceling the laser program. The pushback worked. Police admitted the data was inconsistent. But the LAPD says the predictive policing tool, PredPol, is still in operation. So let's think about the incentive structures with some of the predictive policing tools that we've been talking about. What does it say about the incentives and the problems we're going to have with these tools that you've got counterinsurgency software then essentially used for law enforcement purposes?
I hate to have such a sinister interpretation, but I think it's about opening up new markets to sell this software to. And law enforcement in the U.S. has, been a great market for lots of military technologies, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think that there's actually the opposite incentive to get it. They have the incentive to get it wrong. Predictive policing software has an incentive to make the sale with police. So their incentive is to make predictions that are as close as possible to what the police already believe is correct.
So given that it's really hard to know if AI has been trained on representative data or not, if we have real reasons to suspect, for example, that there might be bias, then isn't there a question about whether the system should be used at all?
Well, I think that's the fundamental issue, is that we're seeing the deployment of all kinds of automated decision-making systems, or AI, however we want to kind of characterize it. And we don't know the effects until after the fact. After the damage has been done, is primarily how we're learning, quite frankly, about what doesn't work. And I think it goes far beyond bias. I mean, we're talking about aggregating data about us, building data profiles that foreclose certain types of opportunities to us. And what's more dangerous, I think, in the digital age about this is that, in the 1950s, if you tried to get a mortgage, you were black, and you tried to get a mortgage at a bank and you were discriminated against, you were very clear about what was happening. That discrimination was not opaque. And when it moves into a software modeling system, what instead you have is a banker who's like, I'm sorry, Dr. Noble, you just can't have it. And I don't really know why. And so that lack of transparency is one of the things that I think we're kind of trying to contend with here. And this just becomes a wholly normalized process. We don't understand, or with the models for actuarial science for determining whether you're going to pay more insurance, for example, because you live in a particular zip code, doesn't even account for these histories of racial segregation, housing covenants, real estate covenants. So just because we look at the zip code, that doesn't tell us about this long history of discrimination that has sequestered people into particular zip codes. Those are the kinds of things that I feel like over time become harder and harder to see.
I think one of the things that I find that worrisome is that we talk about data being collected for these kinds of systems. And for the most part, data is collected for some completely different purpose. It just happens to be there. In policing, data is created by the police doing what they do. They're driving around, they're stopping people, they're occasionally arresting people, and so forth. That data gets produced and then is used in a predictive policing model. It's not collected for the predictive policing model. That's a second order effect that's used because the data is already there. Now, it turns out that data is a terrible way to predict where future crime will be, because what police do is not collect a random sample of all crime. They collect the data they can see. This is true in most of the places where people are applying AI.
I think it is useful to detect where bias is happening, and simulation can be important. I think that's true. However, it doesn't necessarily allow people to have, again, this conversation that I have been discriminated against, right? It's just sort of leaving the expert analysis to make that discovery, when in fact there are a whole bunch of people that wanted to be homeowners or wanted to move house, and they don't really understand why these decisions are happening.
So as a data scientist, what's your take on this? How do we build a kind of test for when it's appropriate at all to use machine learning and when it's not?
The question should be, who bears the cost when a system is wrong. So if we unpack a particular system and we say, okay, we're building a machine learning system to serve ads, and the ad that we're serving, oh, this customer's searching for sneakers, but we served her a Boots ad. Oh dear, we were wrong. Yeah, no one cares. Right? That's a meaningless problem. The consumer could care less. We get wrong ads all the time, and we're trained to ignore them. Let's compare that to a system which makes a prediction about whether or not someone should get credit. In a credit-based system, if we're wrong, the consumer who should have gotten credit doesn't get it, or the consumer who should not have gotten credit does get it. In both cases, and particularly in the case where someone who should have gotten credit does not get it, that consumer bears the cost of the error. She doesn't get whatever it was that she needed the credit for, to buy a house or a car or something else. The company that failed to offer the loan may bear a small cost, but there are a lot of customers, so they don't really bear much of a cost. And so when the customer bears the harm, we can predict that the harms will be greater because the people deploying the systems have little incentive to get it right.
We know that if people of color are over-policed or poor people are over-policed and over-arrested, they are also likely to be over-sentenced.
Machine learning isn't just used to predict crime. It's also used to decide whether a person should be given bail or how long a sentence a prisoner serves. Criminal courts in the state of Florida use a predictive sentencing program called the Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions, COMPASS. In 2016, journalists at the U.S. news outlet ProPublica investigated COMPASS and discovered an apparent racial bias at the heart of its algorithm.
ProPublica did an investigative report, and one of the things that they found in their hand review of all of the records was that African Americans were twice as likely to be predicted to commit future crime. I found it incredibly interesting, for example, the story that one of the reporters told, that there was a black woman, a young black woman, who had taken a bike in one of her neighbors' front yards and kind of ridden it around. And the person who owned the bike said, "Bring that bike back." And so she did, but a neighbor called the police on her, and she spent 10 days in jail. And the COMPASS software gave her a score of 8 out of 10, that she was likely to commit a crime again. And then they looked at a white man who had a history of violent crime, a history of being in and out of jail, and the software gave him a 3 years, so he was more likely to be released.
Once again, the bias in society was revealing itself in the machine.
All the way down to your right.
The risks of bias baked into machine learning aren't just confined to law and order. Upon release, prisoners must reintegrate into a world that is increasingly automated. Today, for them, as for you and me, opaque computerized systems will help decide their access to state welfare, to private finance, and to housing. Take credit scores. These are shorthand for a person's financial trustworthiness. In many ways, credit scores are the gatekeepers to opportunity. And increasingly, they're produced by algorithms, fed on data blind to context and history.
If that credit report comes back with a low score, that means this individual is supposedly a high risk. So you begin to sort of just go around in a circle. Low credit score, criminal background, can't get housing. Because you don't have housing, you can't get a job because the job that you're applying for requires a permanent residence. You, therefore, again, are stuck in this cycle of inopportunity. You're at the whim of a machine-driven system that decides on the basis of different criteria that are unbeknownst to you.
This is one of the darkest topics of our era. There are human biases in targeting on the battlefield. There are human biases in who gets loans. There are human biases in who is subject to arrest. And these human biases are horrible. Couldn't we fix it with algorithms that wouldn't be biased? But then it turns out the algorithms are perhaps worse. The algorithms have refined the worst of human cognition rather than the best, because we don't know how to characterize the best.
I went to the Work Rebooted conference in the heart of the tech industry, San Francisco, California, to see if AI could be used to bring out the best in human endeavor.
Some people are going to do well, some people are going to do less well.
I met Ben Pring, who heads the Center for the Future of Work at Cognizant, a multinational corporation specializing in IT services.
I know that a lot of people are anxious about the whole notion of bias within the algorithm. And so one of the jobs we've speculated on that'll be created is what we call an algorithm bias auditor, which could be a sort of morphing off of the traditional kind of core audit role to make sure that there isn't unconscious bias within algorithms that are going into production environments within big businesses, so that people can reverse engineer decisions made by software.
You do look at job opportunities opening up, but you have said that you do anticipate some job losses in certain areas, including some that actually people you think haven't seen.
There is a class of new software that has emerged in the last couple of years. In the industry, it's called robotic process automation, RPA. And you can get a team of 500 people down to 50 people. That's the reality of what's going to happen in big businesses, that a lot of that kind of white-collar, skilled, semi-skilled work, mid-level, mid-skill level work is going to be, replaced by this kind of software. And there's no denying that some people will be kind of left behind in that transition.
So what other jobs do you think that AI might open up in 5 or 10 years' time?
So we came up with this job we call a walker-talker, which is this idea that, in a lot of towns around the world, certainly where I live in Massachusetts, a lot of seniors there, very isolated. So what if there was an Uber-style platform where people in a neighborhood could log on to the platform? I've got a spare hour on a Tuesday afternoon, a Saturday morning. I could go and walk and talk with a senior in my neighborhood. So people living in the kind of gig economy, living a kind of portfolio-style set of jobs. They maybe drive for Uber, they maybe drive for Lyft, they maybe do their house through Airbnb, they may do things through TaskRabbit. What if they could literally monetize that spare time they have to go and walk and talk with a senior? That doesn't sound like a technology-based job, but that would all reside on a AI-infused platform in the same way that Uber and Airbnb do.
Most of the people who do care work are women and women of color. And guess what? Guess who's been taking care of other people's kids since they were enslaved and brought to North America? Black women. This idea that somehow these historically oppressed, suppressed communities are now in some type of better situation because there's an app interface between them and the new people who want that work done, and then call it a fascinating new gigging opportunity, I think is just completely nonsense.
The experience of marginalized people basically foretells what's to come for the entire population, right? Degrees of control, lessening of autonomy, a real difficulty in confronting and sometimes resisting these systems.
Some say, if you want to know what's to come with AI, you need to look to China.
The Chinese want to be the primary innovations center for AI. AI is seen as both a potential driver of more social instability But at the same time, the Chinese state thinks that AI can be used as a tool to quell social unrest.
China is home to 1.4 billion people. Its capital, Beijing, has more surveillance cameras than any other city in the world. Facial recognition technology is woven into everyday life, getting you into a bank, your residence, checking you out at a shopping till. With 800 million internet users and weak data protection laws, the Chinese state has access to colossal amounts of data. And China's credit scoring system aims to go far beyond finance.
There's this ambitious goal to have a national unified social credit system that would assign a score to citizens to judge whether their behavior was politically acceptable, was socially desirable.
The plan is for all Chinese citizens to be brought into the social credit scoring system in 2020. It uses data, everything from financial records and traffic violations to use of birth control, and processes that data through algorithmic software to give people a score for their overall trustworthiness. A high social credit score can mean better access to jobs, loans, travel, and even online dating opportunities. A low score can mean being denied some of the modern benefits of citizenship.
Probably the most troubling aspect of social credit system is not necessarily the social credit system itself, but actually the application of some of these facial recognition technologies to expand the surveillance state and to check behavior of citizens in the western region of Xinjiang, where ethnic minorities, the Uyghurs, have been disproportionately targeted in terms of their location being tracked 24/7, whether they're going to mosques, which areas of Xinjiang they're traveling to. And that has been empowered, or is in the process of being empowered, by facial recognition algorithms being connected to security integrators.
The Xinjiang Autonomous Region is home to China's Uyghur population, an ethnic Muslim minority that has faced systemic forced assimilation. A small fraction of the Uyghur resistance to this oppression have turned to violence, including attacks on civilians, leading President Xi Jinping to embark on a so-called People's War on Terror. Aimed at stamping out Uyghur separatism and imposing a secular ideology. New AI-led technologies, particularly facial recognition, are the latest weapon in Xi Jinping's crackdown.
Some reports have indicated that there was a database that tracked 2.6 million residents of Xinjiang, tracked where they were going, and that database had labels of sensitive locations, like whether they were going to a mosque or whether they were going to this particular region of Xinjiang. So that was updated on a 24-hour basis, and that database had, I believe, more than 6 million records. So it was tracking these people real time. A lot of Uyghurs are now in re-education camps. So that's a pretty significant departure from normal life, where you're forced to study in a camp and repeat party mantras.
It's a stark picture of how artificial intelligence can go wrong. The Chinese government deploying AI to track and suppress its own minority populations. Facial recognition checkpoints in Xinjiang use deep learning technology to identify individual Uyghurs, cross-checking them with data collected from smartphones to flag anyone not conforming to Communist Party edicts as unsafe, a threat to state security. Xinjiang has become a testbed for authoritarian AI. This harsh system of control may seem a world apart from the West, but systems like social credit actually have some parallels.
In some ways,
If you think about the origin of some of the social credit coming from some of the major private businesses in China, how different is it really from a kind of Experian or an Equifax or one of these other kind of credit rating agencies that actually do collect also very granular data on Westerners, and that data is then shared with all kinds of other entities and used to make consequential decisions?
In current operation, I would say that they're different. I think the difference will be when it's not just your financial behavior, when it's also your social and your political behavior that gets observed. And oftentimes the social credit system becomes a projection of our own fears about what is happening in our societies in the West, where it's not necessarily what is objectively happening in China that is important, but it's about using what's happening in China as a way to project what we're afraid of.
So when I think about China's millions of Uyghurs being tracked 24/7 by AI and potentially put into re-education camps, I think about the black community in the United States. I think about predictive policing, and I think kind of East and West. One of the problems and worries I've got with AI is the way that it gets road tested on communities of color and the poor.
The way these technologies are being developed is not empowering people, it's empowering corporations. They are in the hands of the people who hold the data. And that data is being fed into algorithms that we don't really get to see or understand, that are opaque even to the people who wrote the program, and they're being used against us rather than for us.
There's this incredible informational imbalance, isn't there, that even as a handful of companies are acquiring more and more detailed information about each of our intimate lives, we've got, in some ways, less and less information about them and the way that they operate.
It's nonsense when you think about the way in which fraud and corruption are words that get pointed at poor people who get tracked into these highly surveilled systems. And if they don't participate, they actually have no other option. You don't get food if you don't participate. You don't get to go to school if you're not in the system and properly tracked. And so I think these kinds of things are the questions, again, that also might need to be regulated, beyond kind of the technical regulations. One of the limits there is that so much of the pressure or focus in those movements is about perfecting the technology instead of thinking more broadly about, like, what are the values that we're trying to implement and who are they in service of?
Now, Sita, you worked a little bit with the Obama administration, didn't you, on trying to determine how we make some of these automated systems more accountable to us. Did you find that that was a useful exercise? How did that go?
I think there was a genuine interest in thinking about what might be harmful, what might be helpful, what should we think about now in order to forestall or prevent particular outcomes that we can't undo.
That's right.
Right, further down the line. And so there was a lot of interest. I think what's happened since then is there has been this increasing crescendo from industry saying these technologies are inevitable, right? Whether or not you like it, they're coming.
That's right.
And what that creates for members of the community, for citizens, consumers, is increasingly a sense of despair or resignation. Well, we might not be able to do anything about it. And given that increasingly it looks like governments are actually punting to corporate governance structures or corporate governance bodies, it can create a sense of despondence.
I'd like to pick up a slightly different, but I think related part of that to do with AI and the kind of supply chain and actually the labor that is involved with some of this artificial intelligence. Because I feel like the phrase AI sometimes kind of hides like a lot of human labor that's used to make a given system work, right? So you've got people in Kenya who've got to label images to train software for self-driving cars. Or people in Phoenix, right, on very little wages, looking at videos that would come up on YouTube, looking basically all day, every day at a stabbing or a beheading, so that that stuff can be taken off and you and I don't see it on our social media feeds. Isn't one of the kind of problems we don't see, a hidden problem of some of the artificial intelligence economy, that there's a lot of human labor that is required to prop it up?
Sure, you don't see the data janitors from day to day, right? They're not the ones that are, in our line of sight as things like Silicon Beach expands, right? We don't see the sort of disaggregated, geographically dispersed nature of these AI companies and who all is involved in cleaning data, right? And I think that's highly problematic because it is contributing to this sort of magical aura that surrounds AI. It can do all of these things efficiently and instantly, and yet there's this whole kind of body of people that contribute to that. And the fact that in many cases their labor rights are being disrespected, I think, is also a cause for concern.
Yeah, I mean, I think we know now, for example, from researchers, I think of my colleague at UCLA, Sarah Roberts, who's done all of this work around commercial content moderators, bringing them out of the shadows so that we actually understand that there are huge dispersed global networks of kind of call center-like environments where people are doing this kind of moderation that you talk about. One of the reasons why I think we previously didn't know about them is because there's such a deep investment by, the sector in thinking, at least in the US context, of the internet as a free speech zone, for example, and that anything goes. But of course, we know that anything doesn't go. I find it always interesting when I hear the machine learning experts talk about how crude, in many ways, things like kind of visual mapping is, like, is a table, is the cat a cat, right? Still trying to figure out these really rudimentary kinds of questions. And yet, when we see tech leaders in front of Congress, they say things like, we're going to take down, damaging content, violent content of live murders, live suicides with AI to protect workers. And I think that's really interesting because AI is not there.
My name is Sarah. Welcome to Lab 100.
Hey, Corey, great to meet you.
Come on in.
The role of AI in medicine is to not only make better predictions, but to make the doctors' lives better.
You just look at the camera and smile.
But there are some fields where AI is already there and has the potential to do great good. It could well transform the way we practice medicine.
A lot of what we're trying to do in machine learning or big data or AI in healthcare is to predict these healthy to disease transitions. So really tracking your trajectory over time, right? And use those to guide treatment.
So let's have you put the goggles on.
Here at the Lab 100 clinic at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City,
and relax.
I go through an AI-driven health check that generates a heap of data.
So now we're going to pull up all of your results.
Right. Providing a more complete understanding of my physical well-being. With access to this kind of information, doctors could save lives and potentially millions of dollars along the way.
One of the most mature areas in medicine is the application of AI to imaging data, and actually deep learning came from image analysis and video analysis, so it was really well tuned for that type of thing. So an example, looking at radiology images and diagnosing a tumor or finding a hip fracture, those tools were already well tuned for that task. I mean, finding cats in videos. But I think what's clear is that the AI is at least as good in many cases in radiology as a human, is equivalent to a human. Radiologists might be more like airline pilots in a way. So airline pilots are kind of there for takeoff and landing, and then the plane flies itself for the most part. But I think what radiologists are going to basically be doing is looking at the radiology image and basically rubber stamping it for legal purposes, really, until we solve that problem with AI.
AI that prevents disease. What could be better? But in a world where people have to pay for healthcare, what won't be so great is if private companies use your AI health profile to charge you more. The future of AI in health doesn't just depend on the tech. It depends on our values. Is healthcare a human right? Should a person predisposed to heart disease or cancer, because of their low income or ethnic background, have worse care than those better off? The aim should be decent standards for all, not a two-tiered system.
There are so many positive potential applications of artificial intelligence that would change the world for the better. One is very obviously the pattern recognition that AI is good at has proven incredibly good at spotting malignant tumors, right? An incredibly powerful and inspiring medical advance that I've seen some papers on just in the past year. But the technology is going to shortly underpin all aspects of our daily lives. Very shortly, some form of machine learning or artificial intelligence will determine whether somebody gets a loan, whether somebody gets a mortgage, whether somebody gets bail, whether somebody gets paroled. And as we've seen, it may well determine matters of life or death in a military context. So the stakes could not be higher. The quality of your decision-making absolutely depends on the quality of the material that is coming into it. And we have seen in other uncertain human contexts, such as policing, that mass data rinsed through machine learning algorithms has a distressing tendency to replicate and accelerate all of our pre-existing human biases.
If you have a whole technological culture, a whole infrastructure, a whole language that emphasizes a lack of human responsibility and instead emphasizes a system where there are these artificial agents, we pretend they have agency, but what's really going on is we're using them to trick and manipulate each other, then there'll be more and more trickery and manipulation. And if we want to reduce things like drone attacks, we have to emphasize human responsibility.
The drone attacks that killed my client's family showed just how much responsibility we're handing over to technology. But we can take that responsibility back. Our curiosity and drive to innovate has been pushing the bounds of what we can do with artificial intelligence for decades.
As AI is used to make more and more decisions about us, from targeting to policing to social welfare, it raises huge questions. Will AI be used to target minorities or clean up our air? Will it destroy our privacy or treat disease? Will it make us more unequal or fight climate change? These aren't questions that should be decided in the boardroom of a software company. What happens with AI is everyone's business. The world according to AI is our world, and it's up to all of us to be sure it's a just one.